Welcome back, warriors. It's me, Linda B. Thank you so much for joining me here today. So, today I wanted to settle a debate that has been going on in my comment section for weeks. And that debate is, did the parties switch? The political parties. We are going to settle this today. Yes, we are with proof. But before we get started, I want you all to remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, watch the video all the way to the very end, and hit the notification bell. It really helps me out. And I did reach my 20,000 subscriber goal for the month of April. Yay! Thank you all so much for really supporting me. It really means a lot. Now I have another goal, 30,000 subscribers by the end of May. I believe we can do it. I really know that you guys will help me out. Thank you so, so much. Now, without further ado, let's get into it. So I'm going to share this video with you. It's called Timeless and it's by a history. I think she's a historian. Her name is Julie Hartman, and she is going to break this whole thing down for us right now. So without further ado, let's go ahead and share this video.
It was April of 2016. I was a 10th grade student in my AP US history class, which, shocker to anyone who's watched me and knows me, was my favorite course in all of high school. I am a history nerd, was a history major in college, so I paid extra attention in those classes. And I remember vividly my high school APUSH teacher telling me about the party switch, the subject of today's episode. He said that after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, all of a sudden, the platforms of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party just switched. And I remember sitting there. It's so interesting how you have these clear memories of things that you learned in high school. And even though I wasn't conservative at the time, and even though I hadn't done a lot of research on the subject, there was something to me in that moment that didn't make sense. I just thought, wait a minute. So these two parties, a few decades earlier, were fighting in a civil war over the issue of race and of slavery. And then they've come this far to the Civil Rights Act. And then now all of a sudden they just decide to switch. I had this image in my head of them doing like a do-si-do. Like, I just thought it was such an absurd thing to think about. But all of us in the history class smiled and nodded. And I actually think it was on my AP US history exam, the AP exam that we took the next month in May of 2016. So that has always stuck in my mind. And as I have gotten older and read more about history, I have seen just how much this party myth has infiltrated into the historical and political consciousness of Americans today. So I am going to, in this episode, unravel it. I, with the help of Elsie, have done a lot of research on this subject. And I actually believed that it was true up until recently. But what I'm about to tell you in this episode, I believe, will convince you just how much we have been misled on this subject.
And I also believed it was true as well. I really, really did. I was in my Trump derangement syndrome years. Although I typically voted Republican, I did not yet vote for Donald Trump because I believed the mainstream media. And I also believed that the party switched because at that time, I did not know that the mainstream media was just outright lying. I thought if it was on the news, it was correct. I also thought that what was ever posted as historical on the internet was also correct. Silly me, it's not necessarily. And also I thought for sure the factcheck.orgs and PolitiFacts were correct. Not so, because we have to remember that the Democrat Party pretty much owns mainstream media. They are controlling the public schools. That's why prayer is no longer in schools, and certain woke agendas are within the public school system, which is why a lot of parents are taking their kids out of public schools because a lot of them are failing and all of these agendas, because we don't send our children to school for that. And they're over the universities as well. You know, anything that has woke in it, you can be for sure, pretty much always, almost always, if not always, the Democratic Party is controlling that entity.
So I'm going to start here with an operating definition of what the party switch meant, the way that it is taught in American public schools. And then I'm going to go myth by myth. And I'm going to, hopefully, if I succeed in my endeavor, debunk each for you using a lot of historical evidence. And then I'm going to end the episode by answering the question, well, what happened? Because it is true that a lot of white voters in the South used to be Democrat and then became Republican. And a lot of Black voters all throughout the country used to be Republican and then became Democrat. So clearly something did happen. No one denies that something happened, but it did not have to do with race. And what happened, really, to distill it to a sentence, was that the platforms of the parties did not switch. The constituents of each of those parties and their values switched. So let's start here with this working definition that I have found of the party switch. I'm going to come back to this several times throughout the episode to remind each of you. This is according to PolitiFact. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which overturned the racist Jim Crow laws in the South, the GOP, that is the Republican Party, appealed to racist Democrats in the South to become Republicans in order for the GOP to win elections. This is called the Southern Strategy. Reading again from PolitiFact, quote, "The Southern Strategy refers to the efforts by the Republican Party to appeal to Southern white voters who were turned off by the Democratic Party advocating for civil rights." So using that as the operating definition, I'm going to go phrase by phrase, clause by clause within that sentence and show you how each of those suppositions are actually not quite true. I'm going to read it one more time. The Southern Strategy refers to efforts by the Republican Party to appeal to Southern white voters who were turned off by the Democratic Party advocating for civil rights. Okay, let's start right now with the first part of that, the Southern Strategy. The myth is that the GOP pursued this Southern Strategy. And here is the evidence that that is actually a myth. There is shanty evidence that it was true. Let's go through some of the arguments that are made to support this so-called Southern Strategy. As I've told you, I have done an immense amount of research on this. I actually read a book by someone who advocated for the existence or claimed that the existence of the Southern Strategy was true. And I read that book in full this past weekend, so I know the facts presented for this cold. And there are a few of them. The first starts with Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a Republican who ran for the president of the United States. He was also a senator, and he ran against President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1964. He lost the presidential election in 1964, actually, I believe, by the widest margin ever in presidential election history. He just had a staggering, really, unfortunately, embarrassing defeat. So a lot of people point to Barry Goldwater as the progenitor or the intellectual godfather of this racist Southern strategy, appealing to white voters to get them to vote to be Republicans. This makes sense that a lot of people point to Barry Goldwater because he was this bombastic figure. He actually, in many ways, is quite similar to President Trump in that he had very forward opinions. He wasn't a particularly polished politician. He just came right out and said exactly what he believed, and he really railed against the Democratic Party. So a lot of people, especially on the left, viewed Barry Goldwater as this racist guy. Now, according to one of the authors on the book that I read about the Southern Strategy, Joseph A. Airstrup, he wrote The Southern Strategy Revisited, Republican Top-Down Advancement in the South. Apparently, the RNC chairman in the early 1960s met with Barry Goldwater to discuss this Southern Strategy. The problem is we don't have any recorded conversations. We don't have any memorandums or written documents to indicate what might have happened in those conversations. But nevertheless, historians like to point to those so-called conversations to say that's when the Southern Strategy was hatched. Now, it is true that the RNC chairman, the Republican National Committee chairman, Lee Atwater, who was RNC chairman in the 70s, he was also an advisor to President Reagan and President Bush, the father, the first Bush. he gave a 1981 interview in which he talked about the existence of the Southern Strategy. Atwater, oh, I'm sorry. Is it spelled Atawater? Oh, typo. That's why we keep Sean around. Thank you, Shanzi.
Want to just point out that, she stated that Goldwater lost the presidential election of 1964 to Lyndon Baines Johnson. And we know who Lyndon Baines Johnson was. He was a notorious racist. He was inflamed with racism to the nth degree. It was also said that he had something to do with the assassination of JFK and RFK and a multitude of other people as well. And he was reported as having said, we'll have those ends voting Democrat for the next 200 years. That is what Lyndon Baines Johnson said. And because it was a Democrat president, and at the time, Martin Luther King Jr. was standing there when Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act bills, it made, Lyndon Baines Johnson, it made him look good. But people back then just really didn't know. Some knew. And if you knew anything, you probably wouldn't be alive much longer. Just saying, because he had an uncanny way of getting rid of people who knew anything. And that sort of thing is still going on today. If you notice, not just in politics, but particularly I am talking about politics in 2024. If someone knows something, they are typically gotten rid of one way or another. Whether it's through lawfare, whether it's through some other means, they mysteriously end up missing. This has happened in other countries as well.
So Mr. Atwater in 1981 gave an interview, and many people point to one of his quotes in that interview as evidence of the Southern Strategy. He is on the record, and there is a recording where Mr. Atwater said, quote, "You start out in 1954 by saying N-word, N-word, N-word." He actually said in the recording the N-word. Obviously, I'm not going to say it myself here. By 1968, you can't say N-word. That hurts. So you start saying stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff. So basically, to translate this quote, it appears that the RNC chairman is saying that it no longer was politically or socially permissible to be overtly racist, that is, say the N-word or other racial slurs. So the Republican Party started talking about forced busing, states' rights, i.e. coded language of racism in order to enact this so-called Southern strategy to win over racist white voters to the Republican Party. Look, he said it. I'm not going to deny that he said it. It could be true. There could be a Southern strategy that happened. But the evidence indicates otherwise. That is the one quote out of all the reading that I have done that points perhaps to the existence of the Southern strategy. But if you go back to Goldwater, who is really the guy that is originally pointed to as the progenitor of the Southern strategy, the piece of evidence that a lot of people use is that Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So he had to be this racist right-wing bigot who hated Black people so much that he didn't want to give them equal civil rights compared to other citizens. There's a slight issue, though, with that piece of evidence. It is true that Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act. I'm going to get to why in a moment. But people who say that he was the godfather of the Southern strategy overlook some other facts. Barry Goldwater, before he ran for president and before he served in the United States Congress, actually ran his family business. This was the Goldwater's department store. It was a chain department store with locations all over the state of Arizona. Did you know that he desegregated his family business? Did you know that Barry Goldwater was not only the head, but the founder of the Arizona chapter of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Color People? So he walked the walk with regard to civil rights. He walked the walk with treating Blacks equally as whites. But he did oppose the Civil Rights Act in 1964 because he felt that it had overreaching, invasive parts of it that really ought not to be the role of the federal government. What the Civil Rights Act did is it mandated that both public and private businesses must desegregate. Now, with regard to public businesses, that makes sense because Everyone should be able to access public accommodations equally. Those public accommodations are paid for by people like you and me, taxpayers, so everyone ought to enjoy the things that they pay for. But with private businesses, Barry Goldwater argued that implicit in the First Amendment, which is the amendment that gives us the right to freedom of speech, is also a freedom of association, that people, especially private businesses, can associate with their customers however they want. And so Barry Goldwater really opposed the Civil Rights Act, not because he didn't want to see Black people have the same rights as white people. Clearly he did, because he walks the walk in his own personal life, but he opposed it for government intervention purposes. By the way, just an interesting historical tidbit, which you may know by watching my show on affirmative action. You know, the Supreme Court, when they just struck down affirmative action at Harvard and other private universities, guess what law they used to strike it down? The Civil Rights Act. Because the Civil Rights Act gives, as I just said, the government the ability to intervene in the practices of private businesses. So in 1964, the government was telling private businesses that they can't segregate. And now in 2023, the government is telling private businesses that they can't use affirmative action in college admissions. So that is Barry Goldwater. So we see here, doesn't really make sense that he is the godfather of this racist Southern strategy when he in his own life did so much to advance civil rights for African Americans.
This is great information, because if you just give a blanket statement that Barry Goldwater back in 1964 opposed the Civil Rights Act, then you can automatically say, without looking into it further, well, he was clearly a racist. He opposed the Civil Rights Act. But we should always look at why someone did. And that's what a lot of us don't do. If I hear someone oppose the Civil Rights Act, I'm going to say that they're racist. Like, why would you do that? But he did it. The why was because he didn't think that government intervention should be involved in someone's private business, governmental reasons. He, in his own private life, he desegregated businesses, and he was a part of the NAACP. And so that doesn't mean it looks like, well, why did you go against the Civil Rights Act? Now we know why. So we can't just know the what. We got to dig further and know the why. Because a lot of times what happens is things have a nice sounding name like DEI, but when you dig further into it, DEI, which of course stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion, is not very inclusive when it comes to how a person thinks. It is inclusive when it comes to orientation, ethnicity, and immigration status, and other things, and gender, but not ideology. So they pretty much want people to think the same way. So we got to know the why. Why?
Then let's go on to Nixon, who, like Barry Goldwater, is another evil, mustache twirling cartoon character villain painted by the left wing. Nixon, this is according to Airstrup's book on the Southern Strategy, ran a campaign on states' rights and law and order, which were widely understood to symbolize Southern resistance to civil rights. So again here, each and every time, there's this argument that the Southern Strategy was enacted through this coded racist language of states' rights and of opposing things like busing. There was a New York Times article from 1968 in which a spokesperson for the NAACP expressed concern over what she viewed as Nixon's coded racist language. I'm reading here from the New York Times article, quote, "Nixon's appeal for law and order has a special meaning when he uses it. I'm all for law and order, but he is trying to get the support of white backlash people around the country." This idea of coded language continued into President Ronald Reagan's time in office. Apparently, the Southern Strategy was continuing even then. Again, according to Airstrup's book, he is the formidable author on this subject, Reagan's campaign used, quote, racially coded rhetoric, making attacks on the welfare state and leveraging resentment towards affirmative action. But here's the deal, everyone. We all know that nowadays, conservatives are constantly accused of having coded racist language in the way that they speak. There's this whole idea that conservatives love to dog whistle. I am someone who is a conservative. I have worked in conservative media. I have had the honor and the privilege of meeting extremely prolific, famous conservative influencers and figures. I have never once in my entire life heard them say anything racist or use these so-called dog whistles in coded language. Don't you think if conservatives were using these dog whistles, then we would all like meet together and talk about what the dog whistles were? It makes no sense. It's just an attack. It's actually a race hustling attack to paint people with whom you politically disagree as racist. So we see here with the so-called Southern strategy, there's no recordings besides this one, which I do acknowledge, by Lee Atwater. There's no documents. There's nothing that indicates that this really happened.
And that is what the left does. The left always hollers racism, no matter what someone on the Republican side will say. They'll say law and order. Well, you just being racist. They'll talk about cleaning up the streets. They'll talk about whatever. They just go racism. You're racist. And that is a sign. The person doing the finger pointing, that's a sign that they're the racist. Because, and I like to bring everything back to the word of God. If you read your Bibles, Christians, the devil is called the accuser of the brethren. So one of the things that Satan does is he's always accusing. He's always accusing with no proof, just accuse. And that is what the left does to the right. Accuse all the time. You're racist. That's a dog whistle. Well, yeah, John Legend, well, Trump is racist at his core, and there's no proof of him being racist. All those rappers hanging out at Mar-a-Lago, all the things he's done for people in the past, given awards by the NAACP, appearing on black TV shows, hanging out with people thinking he's cool. But when he runs for a Republican candidate for president as a Republican, if he were a Democrat, they wouldn't be saying that. But since he ran as a Republican, so now after all these years, all these decades, now he's a racist. That's a bunch of BS.
All right. Finally, the final piece of evidence for this Southern strategy, and it just really, again, shows this race hustling by the left, not by the right, is what President Bush did, the father, in his 1982 presidential campaign. He played a clip. He was running against the governor of Massachusetts, Michael Dukakis, and he played a clip about crime, which many point to as evidence of this insidious racism. Let's listen to the clip, clip one.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Okay, so people point to this as this horribly racist advertisement because it profiles a black man who committed a crime. And the left says that, of course, conservatives are doing this and they are inculcating this fear among the populace that black people are out committing crime. But let's look at the facts here. That ad is not untrue. While Dukakis was governor of Massachusetts, he enacted this furlough from prison law, which furlough is allowing people who are incarcerated for in extenuating circumstances, maybe the death of a family member, to actually get out of prison for a few days. And it is true that Willie Horton was incarcerated in the state of Massachusetts. He had committed murder. He was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And while he was released for a weekend as the beneficiary of Dukakis's Massachusetts furlough program, he failed to return. And he actually was later recaptured because the authorities couldn't find him. And he was convicted of committing assault, armed robbery, and rape in Maryland. And he actually remains incarcerated there today. So you decide for yourself. If you think that's a racist video, giving the facts, I suppose you are entitled to your opinion.
Yes, this is the thing, because left-leaning people, they're not for the death penalty. They look at the death penalty as racist. If you're for the death penalty, you must be racist. Well, are you going to say the Holy Bible is racist? Because in the Bible, God talks about someone taking the life of somebody else. God in the Bible is for the death penalty. And you see, when you're lenient on crime, what happened here? This man got out and committed another heinous crime on his weekend pass. He's already a criminal minded person. So, of course, he's not going to go by the rules and be like, I got to obey the rules. They let me on a weekend pass. I got to do the right thing 9 times out of 10. Some of them will try to do the right thing and say they're giving me some kind of leniency. I'm not going to take advantage of it. But he took advantage of it. That's what people who are criminal minded do. Forget about what color the person is. Did he do this? Is my question. Because let's be truthful. Let's get our feelings out of the way. You see, I got my facts over feelings t-shirt on. And so let's be truthful. In any ethnicity, we're all one race, the human race. Let's get that out of the way first. In any ethnicity, whether it's white people commit more crimes if they're criminal. I'm talking about criminal people in each ethnicity. Most people are not criminal. We know that. But I'm just saying, to just make a point here. White people who are criminal kill more often than not, more white people. Black people who are criminal minded more often than not kill other Black people. So most of the time, not all the time, I didn't say all the time, I said most of the time, someone in a particular ethnic group is going to hurt, murder, stab, rape, steal from people in that ethnic group. So letting somebody Black, and this is what Black people do, because I've heard Black people say this, and don't tell me, no, I know we say this. Black people mostly that I've heard from, I can just say from my own life experiences, are typically not for the death penalty because they consider it racist, because they feel like it more disproportionately affects Black people. But when you have a person who happens to be Black, who is a murderer, if they get out, 9 times out of 10, they're going to murder another Black person, rape another Black person. When you see a dead Black man in the street under the age of 30, 9 times out of 10, he was murdered by another Black man like him. So if you want crime to get better in Black communities, you got to get rid of the bad apples amongst the Black people. Take those out so that those of us who don't commit crime can live in peace. I don't want to hear anything else about the death penalty being racist. Because if you that's why crime in Black communities is allowed to proliferate and just keep going. Because they shush people up with snitches get stitches. And people don't say anything. And then crime just keeps going through the community. BS on that one too.
So that's the first part of this. There is shaky evidence that the Southern strategy actually happened. It appears that most people were pointing the finger at conservatives, saying you are using the supposedly racist coded dog whistle language. That is the extent of evidence, besides that one recording, that I have found on the Southern strategy. So let's go to myth number 2. Again, going back to the working definition, the Southern strategy refers to efforts by the Republican Party to appeal to Southern white voters. That we know the Southern strategy may not have existed. Let's go to the second part. These Southern white voters were turned off by the Democratic Party advocating for civil rights. So this brings us to myth number 2. The Democratic Party overwhelmingly was not advocating for civil rights. It was actually the Republican Party, not just in 1964, but the Civil Rights Act of 1960, and literally for about 100 years before that. But let's start with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Yes, it is true that President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law. What happens is the Congress has to pass it. It goes up to the president. The president can veto it. Congress can override that veto. LBJ did sign that into law. And there were some Democrats who supported the Civil Rights Act. However, the Civil Rights Act was overwhelmingly passed by Republicans. In fact, Southern Democrats put up a 74-day, that's over 2-month long filibuster against the voting of the act. Finally, when it got to a vote, Republicans vastly disproportionately voted for its passage compared to Republicans. Now, in 1964, it's important to understand this, both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, were democratically controlled. And the president, LBJ, was also a Democrat. So we look here, though, if we look at the percentages we see that in the Senate, 69% of Democrats voted for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, compared to 82% of Republican senators. And 31% of Democratic senators voted against the Civil Rights Act, compared to 18% of Senate Republicans who voted against. So there were Democrats and there were Republicans who voted for or against. But if you look here at the percentages, way more Republicans proportionally voted for it as opposed to against it, and far fewer voted against it. Then we go to the House of Representatives. House Democrats, 61% of them voted for the passage of the Civil Rights Act. 80% of House Republicans voted for the passage. 39% of House Democrats voted against, compared to 20% of House Republicans who voted against. That's just 1964. Let's go back 4 years to the Civil Rights Act of 1960. There actually was such a thing. It didn't overturn Jim Crow, but it did get rid of some of the more racist voting laws and other just really bad tactics that were practiced in the South. By the way, before we move on to 1960, I just want to give you one more fact about 64. 21 Democratic senators opposed the passage of the Civil Rights Act. 20 continued to be elected as Democrats or were replaced by other Democrats. And on average, those seats did not switch to the Republican Party for another 25 years. That alone debunks this idea that all of these people were so outraged by the passage of the Civil Rights Act that they switched to the Republican Party. If 20 out of the 21 Democratic senators who opposed the Civil Rights Act stayed Democrats and continued to stay Democrats for 25 years, then how does this whole Southern strategy party switch make sense? But as I said, if you go back to 1960, there was also a filibuster enacted by Southern Republicans against the passage of the 1960 Civil Rights Act, and the vast majority of Republicans, as compared to Democrats, voted in favor of it. Let's go way back in time, though, about 100 years earlier. The Republican Party had a consistent track record of advocating for civil rights, whereas the Democratic Party had a consistent track record of not advocating for it and actually trying to put up a lot of barriers. The Republican Party was founded in 1854. 2 years later, in 1856, the first party platform adopted by the first Republican National Convention promised to defeat, quote, those twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. So let's pause for a moment. We know that now in 2023, the Republican Party is extremely anti-polygamy. So do you think that we have just kept consistent on polygamy, but then switched on race matters? It doesn't make any sense. The values have been consistent over time, and the track record, in addition to the rhetoric, proves that. In 1860, President Lincoln, the first Republican president, was elected, and 6 weeks earlier, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union in order to defend the practice of slavery. Republicans were anti-slavery. They were fighting on the side of the Union. Democrats in the South were pro-slavery, fighting on the side of the Confederacy.
That is so true. I just reacquainted myself with this information, although I had already looked at it before. It is true that the Democrat Party was founded first, I believe, in 1829 or something like that. It was formed first, the Democratic Party, and they were practicing slavery and polygamy. Which party today does a sneak attack when it comes to things that are racist, calling the other party racist, but Democrat-led cities are in the toilet when it comes to the public school system, not keeping people knowing how to read at grade level, and also the party that promotes these different orientations and these different lifestyles, the Twan movement and things like that. Which party is that? You know it's the Democrat Party, because polygamy was the thing back then. And then the Republican Party came about, what she said, 1854. And the Republican Party was comprised of people who were against slavery. They called them abolitionists. And they were also against polygamy. Which party today wants the kids in these Black public schools, the parents, to have school choice? That's right, the Republican Party. They always say yes to school choice. Democrats always say no, no. Stay not knowing how to read, just like the slave owners on the plantation. Black people couldn't know how to read. Still the same thing today. Today, in 2024, I know this video is a little old, but today, Democrat politicians that typically go along with the party and everything don't go for school choice. Republicans do. Which party is for conservative values, not promoting those different lifestyles that the Bible talks against? Which party is that? That does not promote these evil lifestyles. Which party is that? Republican. Period. So if the party switched, how come everything is consistent over the years the same? The same. She's debunking everything bit by bit by bit. Some of this I've already said, and I did my Carol Swain video as well that you can go back, and I'll try to remember to link it at the end of this one. But this is really, really good information. You need to share this with people that believe the party switched. Tell them no, they did not. Show them this video and see what they say.
The Civil War lasted until 1865. In 1865, 1868, and 1870, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. The 13th freed slaves. The 14th promised citizenship to blacks as well as whites. The full benefits of citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment guaranteed an equal right to vote. Now, we do know that the 15th Amendment, which gave equal voting rights in practice because of the Jim Crow South, did not come into full effect. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, guess what? They were blocked by Democrats and voted in Congress by Republicans. In 1870, the first Black senator and the first Black congressman served, and they were both Republicans. Every Black representative in the U.S. House of Representatives until 1835 was a Republican. Every Black senator until 1979 was a Republican. The first female member of Congress, the first Hispanic governor, and the first Hispanic senator were, guess what? All Republicans. And the first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, was not only appointed by a Republican President, Ronald Reagan, but she was a Republican herself. See a pattern here? Oh, right. But in 1964, with all that track record, we just decided to switch. The Republicans just all of a sudden decided to become super racist and start voting for and becoming white supremacists. Yeah, that really accords with logic. Let's continue. In 1962, there was an Anti-Bigamy Act that was passed by Republicans to end polygamy. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed by guess who? Republicans. The 19th Amendment gave women equal right to vote. This was after 52 years of Democratic Party opposition. The Republican-controlled Congress pressured the Democratic president of the time, Woodrow Wilson, to approve the passage of the 19th Amendment. Only 59% of House Democrats and 41% of Senate Democrats supported the 19th Amendment, compared to 91% of House Republicans and 82% of Senate Republicans who supported the passage. In 1920, the Republican president, Calvin Coolidge, declared that the rights of Blacks are, quote, just as sacred as those of any other citizen. 5 years earlier, the Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson, screened The Birth of a Nation in the White House, which is a movie which glorifies the KKK and lynching of African Americans. He held a boozy party so everyone could watch this terrible, incredibly racist movie. In 1928, Republican President Herbert Hoover won over 47% of the Southern popular vote. And this is important because it shows that Republicans, although it was a minority, did start to have a presence in the South. This upends the idea that it was only after the passage of the Civil Rights Act that all of these people started voting for the racist Republicans in the South. There was a presence of Republicans in the South. In 1936, during the Berlin Olympics, a gold medalist, Jesse Owens, who himself was a Republican, was not invited to FDR, a Democratic president's White House. He only invited white Olympians to the White House. In 1952, I know you're probably thinking, enough with the facts, but there's a pattern here. In 1952, Republican President Eisenhower 1 Southern states. And in 1954, he supported the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate public schools, despite overwhelming Democrat congressional opposition. In 1956, Republican President Eisenhower also won a lot of the South. It shows that Republican support actually grew for him in the South after he took these pro-civil rights measures. And then that brings us to 1960 and 1964, which, as I have demonstrated to you, were these 2 Civil Rights Act where the Republicans overwhelmingly voted to pass it, the Democrats overwhelmingly opposed. Okay? So again, I present a common sense question. After all of that history, why in 1964 would we just suddenly decide to become racist? It literally makes no sense. It's actually insulting to the intellect of the American people to try to push this. Also, let's look at the way that people voted in the South after the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The myth.
I want to just pause real quick. This is great information. And I want you all to really engage with me in the comment section, because I get those comments. Tell the whole story, Linda B. Tell them about the party switch. Well, we're talking about that. We're doing the whole story right now with years and facts, percentages, and everything. And I know some of what she's talking about already, having looked into this. If I thought that she was just giving out ridiculousness, I wouldn't be doing a video on it. This is factual. You all can go back and check, but you can't just go with what someone does, but you got to go into the why of it. Republicans have a history of supporting Black people from the moment of their inception of their party in 1854 all the way until now. I think what happened was the Democrats figured out a way, since Black people had the right to vote. LBJ did not want to sign the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. He was a racist. He was a racist. I already told you he was reported as saying, I'll have those Indians vote Democrat for the next 200 years. We need to quit with Stockholm syndrome and brainwashing. If you all want to continue with the brainwashing and vote blue no matter who, I already told you that's not smart. That's just plain dumb. I already told you that. But if you want to be on the Democrat plantation, you can stay on the plantation. But guess what? I'm free. I'm with Harriet Tubman. I'm not doing that. Okay? I am not doing that. And I don't care who knows it. I don't care who gets mad. I am not going to be a silent, quiet little Christian conservative in my corner, not saying anything. Unless I feel the Spirit of the Lord saying, Linda, don't say anything right now. I try to go with the flow of the Spirit, what I feel like the Lord is telling me to do. But anyway, we see the history there. Democrats have figured out a way to use Black people to get other Black people to vote Democrat. They used certain civil rights leaders. They sent them to the Black churches. That whole pattern of the overseer keeping the other Black people in line was what they did in the slavery days. And this is what they do now. The Black politicians go to the Black pastors of these Black churches to get their congregation in line to vote a certain way. They still do it with souls to the polls. See my Vince Everett Ellison videos. He said, give him a pork chop sandwich and a drink. I said it so Southern, didn't I? Okay, let me say that again. A pork chop sandwich and a drink. Okay, okay. Anyway, so let's just stick with facts. Facts over feelings.
Is that they all of a sudden started to vote Republican. They just switched on a dime. Well, in 1968, Richard Nixon, supposedly the father of the Southern strategy, actually lost the Deep South. So that either shows that the Southern strategy was a failure or that it didn't exist. In 1976, this is over a decade after the Civil Rights Act, a Democrat, Jimmy Carter, nearly swept the South. And in 1992, a Democrat, Bill Clinton, also nearly swept the South. He won Georgia, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Republicans did not hold a majority of Southern congressional seats until 1994. So if the parties switched after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, causing these racist Southern voters to switch to the Republican Party, why did it take 30 years to do so? Okay, Before we move on to what really happened, why the constituency of the parties changed, let's recap. The Southern strategy probably did not happen. If it did happen, it was not terribly successful. People did not leave the Democratic Party for the Republican Party because they were mad at Democrats for supporting civil rights, because Republicans overwhelmingly supported civil rights, not just in the 60s, but for 100 years leading up. And it shows that there has been an immense track record on the part of the Republican Party to advocate for equal rights of all citizens. So what really happened? As I said to you at the beginning of this episode, we can't deny that over time there has been a shift, not a switch, a shift, where a lot of white voters in the South voted for the Republican Party, and a lot of Black voters all over the country voted for the Democratic Party, and that used to be different. What happened here is that the party platforms didn't switch, but the values of the constituents shifted. Despite what we hear nowadays in modern America, with the end of Jim Crow, the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964, race ceased being an issue in terms of political parties and the viewpoints of American citizens. And really what happened is that for a few decades, the Democrat and Republican Party were arguing about things that were truly liberal or truly conservative. And the South mostly has small towns. It's mostly rural, big farming industry in the South. And so that is consistent with small government, anti-regulation, Republican ideology. Also, again, in the South, because it is more of a small town vibe, people care much more about God, family, country, pro-life, pro-gun than people in the North do. The North has all of these big metropolises. Globalization and liberal politics have made these big cities overwhelmingly Democratic. A lot of Black people actually migrated to the North early in the 1900s because the Democrat Jim Crow South was so racist. And over time, we see that the values of the constituents have shifted away from race issues and more about truly liberal or conservative issues. Also, there actually was a race strategy that came to characterize the second half of the 20th century in the United States. It wasn't the Southern strategy. It was the Democratic Party race hustling strategy. We see it today. Conservatives today, as much as Goldwater, Reagan, Nixon, and any other Republican in the earlier 20th century, are accused of being racist, of dog whistling. We see how much race hustling there is today. The Oregon Department of Education says that finding one right answer in math is white supremacy. We are taught that around every corner there's all of this racism. There's racism in the education system, in the police department, in the government. Literally, there's racism. There's racism actually in Band-Aids, they're saying, because Band-Aids are designed with a color that is more fit to a white flesh than to a Black skin color. It's just unbelievable. So there is a race strategy. And Saul Alinsky, who is a hero of the left, Hillary Clinton actually wrote her thesis on Saul Alinsky. He was this Democratic Party fighter. President Obama said that Saul Alinsky was one of his greatest heroes. He wrote this book, Rules for Radicals, in the 60s. And he has this famous eerie line that says, accuse your opponents of doing what you're doing in order to create confusion. They were accusing the Republicans of being the racists and using a race strategy. They use the race strategy every day. Let's listen to clip 3 when our own president, Joe Biden, recently argued in a commencement address to Howard University that white supremacy is the biggest threat facing the United States.
But on the best days, enough of us have the guts and the hearts to stand up for the best in us. The most dangerous terrorist threat to our homeland is white supremacy.
So I've established.
I have a problem with Howard University always getting these bigots to speak at your commencement ceremony. Howard University had Lyndon Baines Johnson speak at their commencement ceremony back in the 60s. Now they have Jim Crow Joe at a commencement ceremony. Howard University, of course, everyone knows is an HBCU, historically Black college and university, one of the top ones, and always has a bigot there speaking at the commencement ceremony. Do y'all know? Okay, Howard University, lovely school. I know someone in my family I love very much goes there. But I'm going to need you all to do better on your research of who you have to come speak at your commencement ceremonies. Because right now you have a history of picking people who actually hate you. You didn't do any research on Jim Crow Joe. Joe Biden was against school integration. Joe Biden was mentored by Robert C. Byrd, a Klansman. Later in his life, he separated himself from the Klan. But he was still mentored by the man when he was a Klansman, him and Hillary. This man said he did not want his children going to school in a racial jungle. This man fought against integration and was against busing. And you all let him come speak at your commencement ceremony? Make that make sense. Okay? But you're not going to have Donald Trump do that. Oh, and oh, by the way, Jim Crow Joe authored several crime bills which incarcerated Black people, primarily Black men, for nonviolent drug crimes when you have a small amount of drugs on you. Gave them almost like life sentences. Jim Crow Joe did that. That is ridiculous. I know some y'all that go to Howard. I'm not saying anything bad about Howard. I'm talking about this piece right here where you choose look like a true racist. His history backs it up. Politically racist. And that's who you have at your commencement ceremony. But you won't have Donald Trump. Because the Democrats have made it their business to accuse someone of what they're doing. That's what they do. But you believe the media. Come on, Howard. Come on. For real? I don't get y'all.
So I've established what Republicans have been doing during this time. What were Democrats doing? Well, first, there was a ton of incredibly racist propaganda by the Democratic Party depicting Black people in stereotypical, just awful ways. And there was all of these newspaper articles that were publishing these racist cartoons. Let's listen to some of the politicians from the Democratic Party in the 50s and 60s. Let's start with Bull Connor, a Democrat who is the Commissioner of Public Safety in Birmingham, Alabama.
You can never whip these birds if you don't keep you and them separate. You've got to keep the white and the black separate. Let the law enforcement agencies, that's what you got them hired for. And the governor of the state of Alabama handle this thing. Now, George asked me to ask you to do that. Do him one favor. Tell your friends when you leave here between now and Tuesday, don't go up there. Leave it alone. They're going to handle this situation.
Well, Bull Connor was not the only racist Democrat in the 50s and 60s who were saying such things about how Black people and white people needed to be segregated. Let's listen to the 4-time governor of Alabama, a Democrat, George McGovern.
Today, I have stood where once Jefferson Davis stood and took an oath to my people. It is very appropriate that from this cradle of the Confederacy, this very heart of the great Anglo-Saxon Southland, that today we sound the drum for freedom, as have our generation of forebears before us done time and again down through history. Let us rise to the call of freedom-loving blood that is in us and send our answer to the tyranny that clanks its chains upon the South. In the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Another note, in addition to all of this evidence that people just overlook, is the Democratic Party of 1910s, 1920s, 1930s is almost identical to the Democratic Party today. And the Republican Party of that time is almost identical to the Republican Party of today. Look at FDR, the Democratic president in the 30s and the 40s. He was a big government Democrat, just as President Biden is. He created the alphabet soup, so it is called, of government agencies. And so what doesn't make sense to me is that there is this myth that the parties switched, but they only switched on race, because Democrats of the early 1900s are not distinguishable from Democrats today on every other issue. But how does it make sense that we just decided in the 60s and 70s to just switch on the race issue? Again, even if you just discard all of the evidence that I just showed you, it rationally, in a common sense way of looking at things, does not add up. Let's listen to a final clip of, again, our President Joe Biden saying that if you don't vote Democrat, you ain't black.
So if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black.
It don't have nothing to do with Trump. It has to do with the fact I want something for my community.
So yes, I will end with a final question. Who was the one pursuing the race strategy here? The Republicans who've advocated for civil rights for hundreds of years, or the Democrats who didn't? Thank you all so much for joining me. I hope that this was informative.
Yes. Let's talk about who the real racists are. The real racist. Let's talk about that. Because we saw from this information that she gave, Ms. Hartman, very good evidence. She did misspeak on saying George McGovern. It was George Wallace that was the governor of Alabama. He was the one that famously said segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. A Democrat. Of course he was a Democrat. Yes, I've said over and over and over again, there are too many similarities between the Democrat Party of old and the Democrats today. So clearly the parties did not switch. Too many similarities between the Republican Party of old and the Republican Party today. And you see what was said. Duke accused the other party of what you're doing, so people get confused. And the Democrats, that's their MO. They are race hustlers. You know, John Legend out here calling Donald Trump a racist at his core. I'm gonna need John Legend to stick to singing, because really politics is not in your lane, boo. That is not you. You need to just sing some songs and play the piano. That's what I need you to do. Stick to that. That's where you go. Yes, I said it. But you all just give me your comments below. I thank you guys so much for watching me this far. Thank you so much for your support. It means a lot to me. Don't forget, on Wednesdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, I go live. Hopefully you can join me and we can engage a little bit more with each other, get to know each other better. All right. Well, until next time, you all be blessed and march on, warriors.